My name is Jordan Reed. I am the CEO of a major technology conglomerate with far-reaching influence. But that day, in the first-class cabin, I was not a CEO. I was just a black man sitting among leather seats where every glance suggested I had wandered into a place that did not belong to me. I remember that moment vividly. The silver tray passed by, crystal glasses filled with shimmering champagne placed before each passenger. When it reached me, the flight attendant, her name was Emily, hair pulled into a tight bun, a faint smile rehearsed like protocol, hesitated. Then she pressed her lips together and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed, but you're not on the champagne service list." I heard quiet chuckles behind me. The man seated next to me, Clark, leaned in, whispering just loud enough for others to catch. "Maybe you bought the wrong ticket. This class isn't really for everyone." The pain wasn't in the glass of champagne. The pain was in the silent complicity of the entire first-class cabin. They watched me as if I were some form of entertainment. But what they didn't know was this. I wasn't a random passenger. I was Jordan Reed, Black CEO. And ironically, my corporation held shares in the very media network that broadcast major airline news. So when the belated apology finally reached me after the flight, it wasn't an apology at all. It was a confession. A confession they had unknowingly signed themselves. If you've ever experienced the sting of being belittled in a place where you rightfully belonged, leave a comment below. And if you want to hear more stories where silence turns into power, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss a single one. Now let's return to that flight, to the moment where everything began with an empty glass. My name is Jordan Reed. That day, I entered the first-class cabin with a calm sense of familiarity. Light gray leather seats, warm golden lamps glowing down as if each passenger were seated beneath their own private halo. The scent of leather mingled with fine wine and luxury perfume, creating an atmosphere that was both opulent and cold. The sound of champagne corks popping echoed in succession, like tiny bursts of firecrackers at some secret ceremony of the elite. I looked around, crystal glasses carefully placed, shimmering with golden liquid. The man in front lifted his glass, gently clinking with his neighbor. A woman across the aisle smiled softly, leaving a trace of lipstick on the rim of her glass. Then my eyes fell on the small table before me. Empty. Only a clean napkin and an upside-down glass. No champagne, no shimmer, no clink of crystal meant for me. The flight attendant approached. I remember her face clearly. Emily, hair in a tight bun, her thin smile polite to the point of soullessness. She placed a glass for the man beside me, pouring champagne with deliberate ease. Then her silver tray froze midair. Her eyes flicked over the ticket on my table, then lifted to me with a flicker of hesitation. At last, she spoke quietly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed. You're not on the champagne service list." The words floated out lightly as air, yet in my ear they landed with the weight of a hammer. I heard another cork pop somewhere behind me, the trickle of champagne. Soft laughter. But those sounds only rebounded, circling back, trapping me in the silence of the upside-down glass before me. I sat still. For a moment, I felt like an outsider at some sacred ritual. Others kept lifting their glasses, kept laughing, but my silence became the odd spectacle they chose to notice. A few eyes flickered my way, briefly, but enough for me to see. They saw, and perhaps they even enjoyed it. I tilted my head slightly, smiling. Not the smile of a winner, nor of a loser. Just a thin smile to keep myself from sinking deeper into the emptiness opening up before me. Because I knew this story would not end with a single empty glass. An empty glass on a flight like this could turn into an earthquake, depending on who was sitting behind it. The only question then was, would they discover the truth first, or would I force them to see it? Emily's formulaic smile stayed fixed on her lips, but I caught the faint tightening at the corners. That wasn't courtesy, it was a wall she built to hide her unease. "I'm sorry, not on the service list." 8 simple words, yet each one dropped like a stone into a still pond. I watched the ripples spread, not only through me, but across the entire cabin. A few heads lifted, eyes darting toward me before quickly retreating, as if afraid of being caught glancing at something forbidden. Emily's gaze flickered across my skin. Quick, but clear enough. I had lived long enough to recognize that look. It wasn't about the value of my ticket, it was about the value of the man in the seat. And in her eyes, this skin color reduced the invisible number on the scale they used to rank passengers. I sat still, as if a thin sheet of ice had formed over my chest. Not out of shock, but familiarity. From classrooms to offices to international boardrooms, I had seen that same look repeated, only the faces changed. And now it appeared in the shape of a first-class attendant with a pale smile and practiced words. I looked down at the upside-down glass. The irony cut deep. Sometimes an empty glass makes more noise than a full table. It told me that even when I had paid for this seat, they still wanted me to know my place, outside the circle. The man beside me, Clark, glanced over with an unreadable look. He didn't speak, just curled his lips as if to say, "See, this isn't your place." No words were needed. I heard it clearly. The faint laughter drifting from the row behind carried like a breeze, fragile but cutting like a blade. I leaned back, keeping the thin smile on my lips. I had no intention of asking for another drop of champagne. I wasn't thirsty for wine. I wanted to remember this moment, etch it deeply, because I knew silence sometimes carried more power than argument. Part of me burned with anger, but another part found it darkly amusing. Amusing that they believed withholding a glass of champagne could remind me of my limits. What they didn't know was that the true limits belonged to them. I said nothing. I let the tension settle like trapped heat in a sealed cabin, and I told myself, let them think they've won. They'll soon discover a far harsher truth. I smiled faintly, slowly leaning into my seat. No protests, no frown. To them, my silence meant defeat. They believed the humiliation they had sown pinned me to the leather seat, small and out of place in first class. But inside, I felt something else. I realized I had been handed the perfect opening scene. A fascinating game board had been laid before me, and they had unknowingly placed me at its center. I studied the cabin, Clark next to me, shoulders slightly raised, as if the refusal had confirmed what he already believed. The heavily made-up woman across the aisle curled her lips in a half-smile, a smile that made no sound but left its mark. And Emily, the attendant, hurried off, leaving behind the upside-down glass as an unspoken reminder. I drew a deep breath. The sting of the initial insult gave way to clarity. This moment was more valuable than any glass of champagne, because it gave me something money could never buy. A story. A story that, when told, would not only speak of me, but expose the very system that created this spectacle. And the irony? I was the one with the power to spread that story farther than they could ever imagine. In this world, information is the sharpest weapon, and I had just been handed a treasure chest of it. I even found myself laughing at their shallowness. They thought an empty glass could diminish me. But that same glass reflected the entire truth. Who in this cabin was truly small? I kept my thin smile, giving nothing away. Let them keep believing they had won. There is no greater satisfaction than watching the smug play lead roles in a drama they don't realize that they're only extras in. In my mind, a thought rang clear. Every chess game needs an opening move, and sometimes that move doesn't have to come from me. They thought they had humiliated me, but I knew when the curtain fell, the audience wouldn't remember their laughter. They would remember the moment their entire system was exposed, by nothing more than an empty glass. The man beside me leaned in, his breath tinged with the lingering scent of wine on his lips. His voice was low, but loud enough to spill into the nearby rows. "You sure you bought the right ticket? This class isn't really for everyone." His name was Clark, a businessman drunk on his own confidence, wrapped in a three-piece suit and flashing a watch that never stopped scattering light. His words slid out like a blade hidden in velvet, small but razor-sharp. I stayed still, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the sky stretched endless and blue, but inside the first-class cabin, the air suddenly tightened. Clark didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to accuse me outright. One whispered line was enough to seed the thought in everyone's head. I didn't belong. I heard muffled chuckles from the row behind. Not loud, but contagious, spreading like an invisible virus. Each smirk, each fleeting glance felt like a pinprick stabbing at my silence. Clark sat upright, eyes locked on the screen in front of him, as if his remark were just casual small talk. But I knew better. It wasn't casual. It was deliberate. That's how the privileged play their game. They don't strike openly. They chip away, plant doubt, make you feel wrong even when you were right all along. I looked at my own hand resting on the seat. My fingers curled slightly, then loosened. I remembered the years gone by, the boardroom entrances, where, even as the leader, I was asked, "Which department are you from?" I remembered the international summit where I was mistaken for a waiter, simply because I was the only black man in a sea of white suits. Today's humiliation wasn't new, but this time it felt different. Because they didn't know. I wasn't just any first-class passenger. I was Jordan Reed, the man who could turn each of these barbed whispers into undeniable proof of the truth they tried so hard to bury. I let out a thin smile. Subtle enough that Clark wouldn't notice, but enough to steady my pulse. Inside, I told myself, whisper all you want. Sometimes whispers echo louder than shouts. A few eyes flickered with light. Not the cabin lamps, nor the screens. These were the sparks of resentment and amusement in the stares circling me. Clark had tossed a spark, and now the whole cabin waited to see what it might ignite. The quiet laughter spread. Behind me, across the aisle. Not loud enough to call an outright insult, but sharp enough to cast me as the centerpiece of a silent comedy. I kept my gaze on the window. Outside, clouds stacked like soft walls, serene and weightless. Inside, I sat in a courtroom with no laws. There was no judge, yet clearly I was the defendant. Clark had cast himself as the prosecutor, dropping his honeyed accusation. "You don't belong here." The others became the jury, their eyes and laughter delivering a verdict before I could speak a word in my defense. I noticed a man a few rows up shake his head, lips curled. Not at Clark, but at me, as if confirming that the charge was true. Across the aisle, a woman hid her laugh behind a silk scarf, but her eyes gleamed, as if she had just witnessed the day's finest entertainment. I exhaled slowly. In that moment, I realized it wasn't champagne or leather seats that defined first class. It was the game of power. An old, tired game where those perched higher on the ladder made sure to remind you that you stood below. The feeling was familiar. It carried the weight of boardrooms where I presented strategy as CEO, yet a few eyes still saw me as the newcomer. It carried the sting of hotel lobbies, where doormen handed me valet tickets instead of a welcome, assuming my role before I had spoken a word. They always believed my skin set the boundaries of who I could be. But this time felt different. Because I saw it clearly, their glances weren't just wounds. They were bricks, exposing the invisible wall they had built around their world, and I, in silence, was forcing them to reveal every stone. I kept my posture, eyes fixed out the window, as though I hadn't heard a thing. Inside, though, I smiled. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a hostile crowd is nothing at all. I laughed inwardly. Not a sound anyone else could hear, but a private laugh just for me. How ridiculous that they believed a few whispers, a few glances, could erase my presence in this cabin. Clark took another sip of champagne, his watch spraying light across the table as if to flaunt its power. The silk scarf woman still wore her sly smile as though enjoying a silent theater. And me? I sat there letting them believe I was the side character in a story they thought they controlled. But the truth was the exact opposite. I wasn't the side character. I was the one holding the pen. And no matter how polished they looked, they were only playing fools in a script they didn't know I was writing. They had no idea I was a shareholder in one of the largest media networks, the same network that ran stories on airlines nationwide. One whisper from Clark, one disapproving shake of the head, one upside-down glass in first class. All of it could become national news if I chose. I pictured it. One evening, households across the country turning on their TVs. The headline scrolling across the screen. Black passenger denied champagne in first class. I could almost see Clark's face, Emily's sudden panic as she remembered saying, "Not on the service list." I didn't chuckle out of spite, but out of clarity. They had tried to use privilege to shrink me. They didn't realize I held a different kind of privilege, the power to tell the story. And in this world, that power outweighs any glass of champagne. My silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. I let them savor their illusion of victory because that false sense of triumph would make the reversal hit even harder. I touched the upside-down glass, my fingers sliding over the cool surface of crystal. A small gesture, unnoticed by anyone else. But to me it was a signature, a vow that this moment would not be forgotten. It would be exposed, made clear for all to see. I tilted my head, closing my eyes as if to rest. But inside I was already crafting the script. And this time I knew for certain, the lead role was mine. They thought they were writing the story, but soon they would realize I was the one holding the pen. I pressed the call button. A small chime sounded in the cabin, neat, precise, like the opening signal of a new chess match. When Emily returned, I didn't raise my voice or show irritation. I simply looked her straight in the eye and said calmly, "I want to know the reason." For a split second, the light in her eyes stalled. Then she hid it quickly behind a thin smile. She gave a slight nod and walked away. First class, which had been buzzing with the sound of wine being poured and soft laughter, suddenly held a pocket of silence. It seemed everyone understood I had chosen not to sit quietly and endure. A few minutes later, a man approached. Tall, a bit stiff in his posture, his uniform fitted across his shoulders and back, nameplate gleaming on his chest. This was Mr. Hale, the purser. He stopped in front of me and dipped his head in polite acknowledgement. "Is there a problem, Mr. Reed?" His voice was low and courteous, but laced with something that sounded like caution. I repeated myself, this time more plainly. "The reason I'm not being served champagne. I want to hear the answer." Hale glanced briefly at the ticket on my table, then lifted his face again, expression unmoved. He drew a light breath, as if weighing each word. Finally, his voice came out steady, emotionless. "We have a priority policy for certain passengers." A short sentence. Smooth and spotless. No explanation, no apology, no admission. Yet to me, it felt like a door left slightly ajar, revealing an entire invisible wall behind it. I looked at him. Those gray eyes never said the words "don't belong," but the silences inside his answer suggested plenty. I didn't need to ask further. That priority policy was never printed in the flight manual, never shown on the airline's website. It lived only in habit, in tacit nods, in glances sharp as blades. First class grew heavy. A few passengers pretended to busy themselves with the screens in front of them, but their ears were tuned to every word that fell from Hale's mouth. They knew, as I did, that this wasn't any official rule. It was a thin curtain thrown over a stark reality. I sat upright and nodded very slowly. "Priority policy, I understand." A flicker of relief flashed in Hale's eyes, as if he had finished a speech he'd been obligated to deliver. He bowed slightly and stepped back. But I did not forget. I etched those words into memory. Priority policy. Priority policy. 2 simple words, enough to sketch an invisible wall. There is a priority policy for certain passengers. The sentence slipped out lightly, like a thin sheet of paper dropped to the floor. But inside me it landed like stone. A harmless-sounding phrase so smooth it offered nothing to grab onto, carried the weight of centuries of prejudice that had nailed down generations. Hale, the purser, stood with a cold, impassive face. Not a single crease betrayed emotion. He spoke as if reciting a contract clause, an objective fact no one had the right to contest. And perhaps in his eyes, I was just a small dot in that unwritten policy. I sat in silence. Outside the window, thick clouds stacked one over another, a white wall blocking the view. It struck me as the reflection of those invisible walls I had just heard summed up in 4 dry words: priority policy. I had met this thing all my life. In schools, they called it selective admissions. In the workplace, it took the form of culture fit. In society, it morphed into unspoken standards. And here, on this first-class flight, it wore a luxurious mask, a priority policy for certain passengers. What burned wasn't being denied a glass of champagne. What tightened my throat was the ease in Hale's delivery. As if this discrimination were so familiar, so reasonable, it needed no hiding. like a lullaby repeated so often that both singer and listener believe it to be the natural melody of life. I glanced at Clark. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted. His eyes seemed to say, "You heard him, right? These are the rules, and you're not in." The woman with the silk scarf tapped her finger lightly against her glass, the delicate ting ringing like a bell confirming Hale's words. In first class, no further explanation was needed. Those 4 words, priority policy, were enough to secure consensus. A silent agreement more powerful than any gavel drop in a courtroom. I drew a slow breath, letting the heat in my chest cool. I knew I couldn't smash that wall by shouting, but I also knew that every word they spoke, every look they exchanged was turning into a brick of evidence. And when the time came, I wouldn't need many words. I would simply point to the wall and let the world see it for what it was. Because sometimes the most dangerous power isn't in the rules that are written, but in the invisible policies no one dares to name. I nodded, slowly, calmly, so measured it might pass for acceptance. No objection, no argument. I knew some battles require no swords, no shouts, just a perfectly timed silence, and a few cold words to stand as witnesses. Haley's face loosened a fraction as if he had completed an unpleasant task. To him, my silence signaled surrender. To those around us, it proved I had accepted the place they believed was mine. But the truth was nothing like that. In my mind, each word he had dropped was being carved like a blade into stone. Priority policy for certain passengers. For him, the sentence was an excuse. For me, it was more valuable than any recorded footage. Because once released, language can't be taken back. And under the right light, it exposes the entire system behind it. I looked around. Clark kept his thin smile, lips curved like a spectator enjoying a good show. The silk scarf woman kept tapping her glass, eyes bright like sparks. They all thought I was mute, compliant. And in that, they bared their truest selves. I saw bitter irony in the scene, and a near-comic edge. An airline could spend millions on ads boasting equality and impeccable service, only to be unmasked by a purser who let 4 careless words slip. I sat straighter, fingers tracing the seam of the seat. Silent, but my mind kept moving. I pictured these words replayed on the evening news, imagined their discomfort at hearing themselves under public light. And I knew that day would come. Strangely, instead of anger, a calm settled over me. I didn't need to shout to be recognized. I needed patience. Because in this game, they had just handed me the trump card. I let the corner of my mouth lift, a thin smile. Not the smile of the defeated, but the smile of someone waiting for his move. They thought I had fallen silent. What they didn't know was that this silence was turning each of their words into evidence. Evidence that would expose an entire system. I sat still, letting my silence unsettle them when a woman's voice cut through, clear but sharp as the edge of a blade. There are some things money can't buy. I turned. It was Veronica, a woman around 50 with wavy blonde hair and deep red lips. She sat with legs crossed, arms folded, a diamond bracelet glittering under the cabin lights. She radiated a kind of counterfeit authority, the kind that comes not from strength, but from a lifetime of being bowed to. Her words landed with a smirk, a sharp little laugh. What made them sting wasn't the insult itself, but the way she didn't even look directly at me. Veronica spoke as if I were merely a prop for her performance, with the entire first-class cabin as her audience. Her voice cracked the air like a whip, leaving invisible welts behind. A few passengers joined in with polite smiles. Clark beside me cleared his throat in agreement. Laughter rippled through the cabin, thin, fragile, but suffocating in its reach. I stayed quiet, eyes fixed on the window, but ears catching every syllable. I knew I had been pushed onto an unwanted stage where each person in first class appointed themselves judge of my existence. There are some things money can't buy, Veronica declared, while wearing a ring worth the price of a home. Bitterness rose, but so did an ironic smile. Because her words, stripped of their pomp, were nothing more than an admission. There were things she feared could be bought, things she feared could be taken from her. I tilted my head, catching my reflection in the glass. My face calm, but inside I laughed silently. Because I knew if there was one thing money couldn't buy, it was truth. And truth, once revealed, bows to no one. First class was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a theater, and I, though unwilling, had been cast in a role. But I wasn't worried. I understood something. In every play, the character that seems secondary often holds the key to the turn. They thought I was just a supporting role in their little performance. Soon they'd learn it was the supporting role that could flip the script. Veronica's laughter didn't stop at her painted lips. It broke into fragments, spilling into the cabin. Some laughed with their eyes, others with knowing coughs. Different forms, same rhythm, the rhythm of consensus. I sat still, like an unwilling act shoved onto a circus stage with no name. They needed no spotlight, no music, only a target to turn into amusement, someone to confirm their higher ground, and today that someone was me. Humiliation wasn't loud. It was wrapped in soft chuckles, stolen glances, quiet nods of agreement. The silence after the laughter was the cruelest soundtrack. I heard it clearly, like unseen applause pounding against my back. I glanced at Clark. He wasn't laughing out loud, but the twitch at his lips betrayed his satisfaction. And Veronica sat like a queen who had delivered her winning line, waiting for her ovation. She sipped her wine, eyes still gleaming with disdain. In that moment, I thought of life's bitter irony. I had sat in countless boardrooms, signed contracts worth millions, yet here, in first class, they still tried to cast me as an outsider. To them, seats, tickets, even money weren't enough. They needed the added spectacle of humiliation to make sure the line between them and me remained sharp. I looked at the upside-down glass on my table. Under the golden lights, it gleamed like a stage prop, perfectly placed to complete their play. They thought it symbolized lack. To me, it had already become proof of how easily dignity could be strangled by small gestures. I didn't respond, because I knew silence sometimes carried their laughter further, and the further it spread, the more it revealed their truth. I let them act out their drama, unaware they were handing me a treasure trove of evidence. They believed they were laughing at my shame. What they didn't know was that every laugh was ink, writing itself into a record I would one day open. I laughed inwardly, a soundless laugh that pulsed in my chest, sharp and clear. If money can't buy it, what about shares? I sat taller. Suddenly, the first-class seat was no longer a cage of humiliation, but a balcony from which I observed their farce. I wasn't prey among predators. I was the one studying their every move, every glance, turning it all into material. Veronica sipped again, her eyes triumphant. Clark shrugged, as if to say, "See, these are the rules." The cabin played along, each in their own small way, forming a chorus of exclusion. But in my mind, another scene appeared. A newsroom. A headline scrolling across screens. Black passenger denied champagne in first class. I could hear anchors quoting Veronica's line, "There are some things money can't buy," not as her proud declaration, but as a slap against the very system she embodied. What satisfied me wasn't revenge, but the strange fairness of truth. Because once this story left the soundproof walls of first class, it would no longer be a joke. It would be an indictment. And as a shareholder in a major media network, I knew it would take only the smallest nod from me to make it headline news. I drew a deep breath. Their laughter now sounded like background music for a play they didn't realize they were extras in. They thought they were humiliating me. In reality, they were building the very story that would expose them. The upside-down glass before me had become a symbol, not of absence, but of the emptiness in their treatment. I laid my finger against it, confirming silently this was the perfect piece to open a much longer game. And as I sat straighter, I no longer felt endurance. I felt preparation. Preparation for the moment when all the laughter in this cabin would echo back, not to wound me, but to silence them. They believed the story ended here, but I knew the moment they laughed was only the opening act. I opened my laptop. The blue glow from the screen cut across my face, slicing through the golden haze of the first-class cabin. In that instant, a familiar logo appeared, bright, sharp, undeniable, Reed Media Group. That emblem to me was the sum of years of struggle, patience, and countless rejections overcome. But to others, it was a mark of soft power, a voice capable of carrying farther than any shout. I tilted the screen just enough for the light to spill sideways. Clark, still wearing his smug smile, glanced over without thinking. For a brief moment, I saw his eyes freeze. The polished confidence cracked, a tiny fracture spreading across his expression. No explanations needed. I didn't have to say who I was. The logo said enough. He knew my name. More importantly, he knew what it stood for: control over a media network with the power to turn a small incident into a storm. I stayed silent, fingers tapping slowly on the keyboard as if I were simply checking emails. But inside, I knew I had just placed a knife on the table. Not a shiny blade that drew blood, but one sharper than steel, the knife of information. Clark shifted in his seat, gripping his champagne glass too tightly, as if it were an anchor. I caught the glint of sweat at his temple. The smugness from before dissolved, replaced by unease. He knew the man mocked by the cabin wasn't just a passenger. He was a mirror, capable of reflecting their truth back to the world. I allowed myself the faintest smile, casual, like someone remembering a tune. To others, the laptop looked like a work tool. To me, it was the knife I had always carried, now drawn and set plainly on the table for sharp eyes to notice. They thought I sat here empty-handed. The truth was, the sharpest blade rested right beneath my fingertips. I saw the change in Clark. Just moments ago, he'd lounged with ease, smiling like a spectator enjoying light entertainment. But when the screen lit up with Reed Media Group, his grin stalled, frozen into an awkward line. He turned his head away, but his eyes betrayed him, sneaking back toward the screen. And then he faltered, like a man missing a step on the stairs. The name Reed was no stranger in business or media circles. It meant headlines, exposés, scandals dragged into the light when people thought they had buried them deep. Clark raised his glass, but his hand trembled, spilling drops of champagne. He dabbed at them with a napkin, an unnecessary gesture that only exposed his nerves. To me, it was comedy edged with irony. The self-appointed judge suddenly looked like a defendant, undone by a logo flashing for seconds. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence became the soundtrack of his discomfort. He sat stiffly now, shoulders drawn inward, no longer sprawling with ease. He had realized the outsider he mocked was a shareholder in the very machine that could broadcast this moment to the nation. Across the cabin, Veronica continued her performance, oblivious to Clark's unraveling. She laughed, clinked glasses with a man behind her. But Clark no longer laughed. His breath came heavy through his nose, his eyes skittering, as if searching for a way out of a game he had entered too deeply. I turned toward him briefly. Just one glance, nothing threatening. Yet Clark recoiled, his body pulling in like a marionette tugged by invisible strings. In the warm cabin light, he looked less like a confident man and more like a puppet stripped of swagger. And I understood. The knife had already cut. It didn't need to slash. Its presence alone was enough to turn his arrogance into caution. I returned to the screen, tapping a few idle notes. Inside, I smiled. Clark must have been wondering if a logo alone could silence him. What would happen when the entire story spilled onto the news? If a logo could quiet him, what would the world's eyes do? I still said nothing. I didn't have to. My silence was sharper than any rebuttal. All I did was let him see. I held the knife, and I didn't even need to raise it. Clark sat there, turning his glass in nervous circles. The ease was gone. His eyes flicked from me to the laptop to anywhere else. He looked like a soldier realizing he had wandered onto forbidden ground. Minutes ago, he thought I was entertainment. Now he understood. I could make him the entertainment for the entire world. I tapped the keys, simple keystrokes, nothing important. But in the quiet cabin, the clicks rang out like steel striking steel. I wasn't writing anything of consequence. But to Clark, each sound must have felt like a warning, as if the question were carved into the table. Would you dare let this story escape? My silence became an invisible blade. It cut no flesh but sliced straight through his confidence. His shoulders hunched, his flashy watch now glaring like a spotlight on his unease. Meanwhile, Veronica played on, laughing, tossing sharp lines. Clark no longer followed her lead. He sat tense, measuring each blink. And me? I waited. I knew this wasn't a game to win instantly. The knife could rest on the table all flight long. Its presence alone was enough to make them tremble. I leaned back, fingers gliding over the laptop's edge. Veronica's words replayed in my head. There are some things money can't buy. I chuckled inwardly. She was right. This silence, Clark's fear, the tension choking him, the dread that a small story could be blown into a storm, none of it could be bought. Because money can cover many things, but not the truth once it shines on a screen. And with one simple gesture, opening my laptop, I had placed that truth like a blade in plain sight. I turned back to the window, letting the blue light wash Clark's face one more time. No words, no gestures. Because sometimes, true power isn't in what you do. It's in what you don't have to do. I didn't need to speak. My silence was the knife. And now they were beginning to understand who held the handle. After that moment, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter that had once rippled like background music now faltered, thinning into awkward notes. Eyes that had shone boldly like spotlights began to slip away. No one looked at me directly anymore. They buried themselves in their seat screens, flipped open magazines, feigned drowsiness. All flimsy performances, clumsy in their obviousness. I sat still, laptop glowing beside me, the blue light washing my face like a stage lamp. Suddenly I realized first class had become a theater, no curtains, no overture. And yet everything was set for a play in which I, unwilling though I was, had been placed at center stage. Clark, who had once pricked me with his whispers, now sat mute, as if his tongue had been cut. He adjusted his tie over and over, each movement only amplifying his unease. Veronica, who had once smirked and scoffed, no longer wore her icy grin. She sipped her wine, but the gleam in her eyes had dimmed. She looked like an actress suddenly aware the audience had stopped clapping. No one spoke, but I felt the rhythm of the room change. First class, a space built for display, sagged under a quiet tension as if everyone were waiting to see the next act unfold. And I, though silent, was unmistakably the lead. I leaned back, breathing evenly, letting the light from my laptop strike my face again. I didn't need to speak. My silence had already taken command, forcing each of them to rewrite their roles. And when silence becomes the center, every laugh that came before suddenly sounds offbeat, grotesque. A sardonic thought crossed my mind. They had paid for first class to savor superiority, but now look at them, sitting stiff like minor characters caught beneath an unforgiving spotlight, unsure when they might misspeak, unsure how their clumsy performance might be judged. The quieter the cabin became, the clearer I saw it. Power had shifted. It was no longer in their raised champagne glasses, no longer in Veronica's sharp remarks or Clark's whispered barbs. Power now lived in the silence I held, and nothing suffocates a gilded room faster than the sense of waiting for a reversal. They had come here to indulge privilege. Now that privilege had trapped them, turning them into awkward actors in a play I directed with silence. I sat, eyes drifting as though detached, but in truth I was watching everything. Silence gave me a special right, the right to be the spectator, while they, the ones who believed themselves in charge, had unwittingly become the show. Veronica tilted her head, murmuring to the man beside her. I couldn't hear, but her half frown and shrug said enough. Annoying, but let it pass. Clark tapped his fingers against the armrest, eyes avoiding mine, like a schoolboy caught by his teacher, pretending nothing was wrong. Each glance, each gesture became evidence. They didn't understand that when silence rules, the smallest movements blare like brass. A twitch, a crooked smile, a throat clearing all betrayed their unease. I remembered a shareholders meeting years ago. I had presented a major project, and one man rose in fierce objection. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. And the longer he ranted, the clearer his bitterness and illogic became. In the end, the applause wasn't for me. It was for the way he had exposed himself. Today, in first class, I was watching the same scene play out. No one here had been forced to laugh, to side with Clark or Veronica. They had chosen their roles. And now, under the faint glow of my laptop, they were writing their own indictment. I didn't need recordings, I didn't need cameras. I only needed memory. And memory, retold in raw truth, can cut sharper than any footage. I shifted slightly, still silent. The weight of it made the cabin heavier. A man across the aisle coughed, trying to puncture the void, but the sound only thickened the air. I knew every minute they sat here, every second they played their superior roles, was another blade twisting into their own image. I curved a thin smile, not joy, but acknowledgement. For me, not for them. Because I knew, once this story stepped off the plane, I wouldn't need to accuse. They had already done it to themselves. I didn't need to defend or condemn. In this moment, they were both witnesses and defendants. The verdict was already written. I sat there in a first-class cabin, drowning in uneasy silence, and a simple truth struck me. I didn't need to do anything at all. They had already done it all. Every sidelong glance, every forced smile, every pair of eyes that tried and failed to look away, condemned them louder than any words I could say. Clark, who had once needled me with whispers loud enough for all to hear, now sat pale, lips pressed, hands locked on his glass. Veronica, who had lashed me with her voice, now filled the air with awkward, empty gestures, straining to look in control while betraying her unease. No one had to speak anymore. It was all laid bare in the details. The stiffness in Clark's back where he had once lounged with ease. The way Veronica wet her lips, her eyes darting too quickly away from mine. The way others pretended to read, to watch, to sleep, but their eyes betrayed them in guilty flickers. The cabin had become a tragicomic stage where masks slipped to reveal nerves raw and exposed. And I, once set up as the joke, was now the only audience watching the most honest show of all. I almost laughed. They had believed they were laughing at my shame. Now my silence had turned their laughter into evidence of their pretense. They had unmasked themselves, exposed the very system they thought they were upholding. I brushed my laptop, its screen glowing again, catching a few guilty eyes. I didn't need to click. I didn't need to type. Power wasn't in what I would do next, but in what I could, and that possibility alone was enough to keep them restless. I wondered, perhaps this is true power, the power of silence. To sit, to let them keep acting, and to know the more they perform, the more they reveal. I exhaled lightly. The cabin's silence now carried a new weight. Not the silence of scorn they had placed on me, but the silence of fear they now carried for themselves. And I realized sometimes the strongest way to flip the board is never to touch a single piece. The wheels kissed the runway, the plane shuddered softly. I felt that landing as both a period closing a heavy flight and the start of another chapter. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred, unbuckling seatbelts, reclaiming their polished, busy facades as if nothing had happened above the clouds. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up, announcing a new message. In my inbox, a familiar name appeared, Aurora Airlines. I opened the email. The first line gleamed with carefully polished regret. We sincerely apologize for the unfortunate experience you encountered. I read the words, and a quiet laugh rose inside me. What made me smile wasn't comfort, it was the lateness. Like handing someone an umbrella after they've already been soaked through by the rain. The umbrella might be new, even beautiful, but it has no value now except to expose the delay. They leaned on the usual phrases. Unforeseen incident. We are committed to improvement. Your experience is our top priority. Words that sounded as if a team of professionals had locked themselves in a boardroom, carving and sanding them until smooth enough to hide the raw truth. They only apologized once they realized I wasn't someone who could be forgotten. I reclined in my seat, reading again, slower this time. Around me, people grabbed luggage, made calls, laughed. Inside, bitterness spread. Not because I needed an apology, but because I knew this email wasn't really written for me. It was written for them, for their image. It was a costume designed to cover a stain already revealed. I shook my head slightly. If the apology had arrived earlier, when Emily hesitated with the silver tray, when Hale uttered those 4 words, priority policy. I might have seen some value in it, but now, after the truth had unfolded under dozens of eyes, the apology was nothing more than a patch too late to cover the tear. The phone buzzed again in my hand, nudging me to respond, but I didn't. I only looked at the screen and smiled, because I knew sometimes silence is the sharpest reply. Their apology came late, and when an apology comes late, it ceases to be remorse. It becomes evidence of fear. I read with no feeling but the weight of delay. A wound already dry, what use is bandage then? The polished words only drew me back to that moment of humiliation, staring at the cold, upside-down glass before me. The email read, "We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience caused. Your satisfaction is our top priority." I laughed inwardly. If my satisfaction had truly been the priority, why had I become the exception? Why had the priority policy not included me? The bitterness lay not in the apology itself, but in their belief that words could erase truth. But truth does not erase, it lingers. In Clark's sidelong glances, in Veronica's sharp laugh, in the thick silence that smothered first class. No PR team could scrub that from memory. I continued reading. "We are committed to improving our services in the future." Committed. A word so smooth it rolls easily into any apology letter. But to me, it was like a train ticket printed for a journey that had already left. It carried me nowhere but back to the reminder. I had been left behind. Somehow they believed they still controlled the story. But they forgot. Every late apology is a confession. When you say "we're sorry" after the truth has been exposed, you are admitting that the truth exists and that you are powerless against it. I scanned the email's closing, the electronic signature of some distant customer service director, a stranger behind a keyboard tasked with patching what an entire system had fractured. But how could a few hollow lines stitch up a tear in trust? I shook my head again. What struck me wasn't the apology, but the void it revealed, the chasm between what they wrote and what I lived. A gap so wide no gauze could cover it. I closed the phone, letting the email sit untouched in my inbox. I didn't need to respond. My silence once again carried more weight than any crafted sentence. They thought their apology would conceal the truth. Instead, its lateness turned it into the clearest proof of what they feared most. Still, I smiled. Not at the cabin, not at the sender. The smile was for myself, because I knew a truth they hadn't grasped. The media network I controlled stood ready to turn this email into national news. I imagined an ordinary evening, families switching on their TVs, reading the crawl across the screen. Prestigious airline issues belated apology after first-class passenger of color denied champagne. And beneath it, the very polished lines I had just read recited word for word. Once broadcast, they would no longer sound like regret. They would sound like confession. I pictured Clark, Veronica, Emily, Hale, each of them realizing that the small moment they thought buried in silence had been magnified into a mirror reflecting their system. Then, the laughter they had wielded today would return tomorrow as echoes of shame. I traced a finger across my phone screen, but pressed nothing. No rush. This game didn't require a hasty move. Truth has its own momentum. Once exposed, it spreads without force. What amused me was the bitter irony. In first class, they believed I didn't belong, unworthy of a crystal glass. But outside, with one broadcast, I would no longer be the rejected passenger. I would be the storyteller, and they would be the story. I closed my phone, leaned back, letting silence envelop me. Ironic, isn't it? They had spent millions painting a brand, buying gloss. And me? All I needed was to hold on to an email, the one they themselves had sent, to tear that veneer apart. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to argue mid-flight. I only needed patience. Because sometimes the sharpest answer isn't in what you do in anger, it's in knowing exactly when to lower the curtain. They thought the email would bury the story. What they didn't know was that it had become the loudest megaphone of all. Their apology went on air. No longer negotiation, no longer polished like a press release. It appeared across the screen beneath a breaking news crawl. Airline apologizes after black passenger denied champagne in first class. I sat in my office, the glow of the broadcast filling the quiet room. The anchor's steady voice repeated the very sentences I had once read in an email. "We sincerely apologize, my unforeseen incident. Customer satisfaction is our top priority." On the page, those words had only made me laugh. But spoken on television, before millions of viewers, they transformed. They were no longer an apology. They were a confession. I pictured the passengers from that day watching. Clark reclining in his leather chair at home, hearing the echo of his own whisper in memory. Veronica, who had tossed out, "Some things money can't buy," now lifting her glass with trembling hands. And Hale, the man who had uttered 4 casual words, "priority policy," realizing he had signed a public indictment for them dime for the entire system. I needed no commentary. The media did the rest. The people would read, discuss, ask, what made this happen? And why did the apology come only after exposure? In that moment, I grasped the bitter but powerful truth. Sometimes you don't need to shout to be heard. You only need to stay silent long enough for your opponent to expose themselves. I sat still, watching the ticker roll on. There was no applause, no cheers, only my silence, the silence that had begun with an upside-down glass, spread through the cabin, and echoed outward until it forced a corporation to bow. They thought the apology would close the story, but no, it became the opening bell of a wider indictment. I sat there as though I had won a chess game without moving a single piece. The feeling was strange, relief mixed with bitterness. Relief because I had not needed to shout or stand mid-flight to defend my place. Bitterness because I knew the world still demanded that a man like me wield silence as a weapon. In my office, the broadcast light painted my face. The news anchor kept reading the email, every word delivered with solemn weight. I stayed motionless, like a spectator rewatching a match, whose moves I had already foreseen. And each line they spoke felt like a piece on the board, sliding itself into checkmate. Silence, I realized, was not retreat. It was a counterstrike, quieter but sharper than any slammed fist. I remembered the moment in first class, staring out the window, keeping calm. Back then, some thought me weak, others believed me submissive. Now that calm had become the blow that forced an entire corporation back. I hadn't moved a piece. They had misplayed themselves. Clark had exposed his own malice in a whisper. Veronica had confessed through her mocking laugh. Hale had revealed the system in 4 words, and the airline had tied it all together, wrapped in one belated apology. I inhaled deeply. The room was silent, save for the steady tick of a clock, reminding me of that flight, a short journey etched with lasting scars. I closed my eyes briefly. Behind the lids, I saw the upside-down glass glowing under golden light. I saw the cabin laugh, then fall silent. And finally, I saw myself. Not defeated, but as the one who had proved a truth. Sometimes the only way to win is to let your opponent defeat themselves. I hadn't touched a piece. They had moved into checkmate. My silence was the witness. I let out a thin smile, Private. They denied me a glass of champagne. But in that denial, they revealed who truly didn't belong here. The broadcast faded, leaving the room in quiet. I sat there, replaying every moment of the flight. An upside-down glass, a whispered insult, a mocking laugh. 4 words, priority policy, falling like an unseen gavel. Each detail a thread that had woven the fabric of illusion. But they themselves had torn it open, letting the truth shine brighter than any chandelier in first class. I felt no rage, no grudge. What I felt was the clarity of standing over a finished chessboard, seeing each of their mistakes laid bare. All I had done was wait. And in waiting, they had unmasked themselves. I almost laughed at the irony. They had mocked me as if I didn't belong. Yet in the end, they were the ones exposed as out of place. Because first class is not just leather seats, champagne, or service. First class to me is dignity, and dignity cannot be priced or faked with sneers. I thought of Emily, of Hale, of Veronica, of Clark. Each had contributed a piece to that day's tableau. They believed they staged a play to shame me, but now as the story spread and their apology rang out as confession, it was clear. They were the actors in a play I had directed with silence. I set the phone on my desk and drew a deep breath. My seat, my place, had never been shaken. It was theirs that trembled now as the world asked, who truly didn't deserve to be there? I rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the city glowing with lights. Amid the endless traffic, I saw clearly, power doesn't lie in what they flaunt. Power lies in holding silence until the moment your opponent unmasks themselves. And today, I had done just that. A denied glass of champagne had not humiliated me. It had only revealed the truth. Sometimes the ones in the most expensive seats are the least deserving to sit there. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.